It's important to be able to calculate a confidence interval of means or proportions, but even more important is being able to explain what you found in the context of what you're talking about. Going back to the example we had earlier, we had Munchkin and Pino, the puppy and the kitty, and our confidence level was 95%, and we calculated our interval to be somewhere between 45 and 75% of the population. Now in context, we said that we're 95% confident that the proportion of Americans that think Munchkin is cuter than Pino is between 45 and 75%. We got that by saying we did a survey of Americans and we're comparing Munchkins and Pino, the kitty and the puppy. You could also say, if we did our plus minus instead of the interval notation, that we're 95% confident that the proportion of Americans that think Munchkin is cuter than Pino is 60% plus or minus 15%. And it means the same thing as the interval notation, but it's stated where we know what the best guess is first, and then how much error on either side, what our margin of error, what our wiggle room is on either side. Finally, we have an interesting conclusion that we're less than 95% confident that more Americans think Munchkin is cuter than Pino. Now, if we're 45% confident, if that's part of our interval, that the puppy is cuter than the kitty, that means that on this end of the interval, 55% think the kitty is cuter. Now down here on the other end, only 25% think so, but there is a part of our interval where we think that it's possible that more people think the cat is cuter than the dog. So we are not 95% confident that more Americans think Munchkin is cuter than Pino. And when we get into hypothesis tests later on in the next module, we'll talk about how do we give a test of something being more than something else, and there's some other details about how we can look at that. But at a 10,000 foot view here, you can see that our interval extends into the less confident about the puppy side of things. The important thing to remember is that your population proportion is some number. Let's say exactly 56.2% of Americans think the puppy is cuter than the kitty. The problem with this single number is that you don't know what it is, and you probably never will. So you have this number that you're trying to guess, you don't know what it is, and you don't even have necessarily a great way to check your answer. But using your fancy math, all of these bootstrap simulations or other techniques that are out there, you're some percent confidence. Now typically we go with 95%, but you pick your confidence level, how confident you want to be that you know what range the population proportion falls under. Or if you're talking about an average, you know that 95% of the time you're going to be correct about saying that the true mean is in a certain range. You will never know if you're right. You might be wrong, and you will never know it. That's what's frustrating about confidence intervals, but you sometimes just have to trust your gut, trust your statistics. 19 out of 20 might be good enough for most situations. So let's also look at how you sample. You can get the most precise results in the world. You can get the tightest confidence interval you've ever seen, but when you don't have good sampling techniques, it's all worthless. You need to have a simple random sample or something equivalent to it. Equivalent ones that are considered good typically would include a stratified random sample, systematic sample in most cases, and occasionally a cluster sample, but generally not. A convenient sample is always going to be bad. A voluntary sample is always going to be bad. So making sure that you collect data from a good technique. Also making sure you don't have too much undercoverage. If you end up never even attempting to sample a large portion of the population, because let's say you're going door to door and a large percentage of the population you're interested in doesn't have homes, that's going to be a problem. It's going to affect your data, bias your data. And also having low non-response is really important. If you have too many people that you ask to be part of your survey and they don't respond or don't complete your survey, you're going to miss out on a certain portion of the population that might be important. Let's look at some examples here. Imagine the confidence level that you set is 95%, and your question is, do you approve of the president? So you want a 95% confidence interval of how many people approve of the president. Who exactly? Let's focus on Americans. So all Americans are part of the population of interest. The type of data that we have. Do you approve or do you not approve? It's a yes-no question. We're looking at categories. Do you fall into the yes or the no? And we're trying to find the proportion that do approve, that say yes. And if we run our calculations, let's do our sampling, collect all our data, get our confidence interval. Let's say that we get the result 46.2% to 51.6%. So after we go out, collect our data, and do our calculations, we get these numbers. Now what to do with all of this? If we're going to construct that into a sentence, if you assume that we had a true SRS or something similar, we can say the following. I am 95% confident, we get that from our 95% confidence level, that the proportion, because that's what we're trying to find, the proportion of Americans, our population, that approve of the president, that was our question, our variable, is between 46.2% and 51.6%. That's the interval that our calculations found. So you're 95% confident that the proportion of Americans that approve of the president is between these numbers. You will never be sure if you're right. You can also use plus minus notation to say almost the same thing. I'm 95% confident that the proportion of Americans that approve of the president is 48.9% plus or minus 2.7%. All I did is applied that method of finding the middle of these two endpoints of the interval and then figuring out the margin of error, how much wiggle room I have in either direction.